Have you ever heard the phrase, the moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on?
Oh, yeah. It's one of those iconic lines that just seems to, pop up absolutely everywhere in culture.
Right. I mean, Agatha Christie used it as the title for a famous murder mystery. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted it in that passionate Beyond Vietnam speech.
Yeah, and President Bill Clinton even used it in a public apology for the Lewinsky scandal.
Exactly. And you might already know that it's attributed to an 11th century Persian poet.
Hmm.
A figure who is famous for romanticizing wine, writing about the fleeting beauty of the present moment, and just, well, carrying a very rebellious bohemian streak.
That is definitely the popular image, yeah. The romantic poet, gazing out at the stars, a glass of wine in his hand, just totally rejecting the rigid rules of society.
Right. But here is the massive contradiction that we are going to explore today. That quote-unquote poet was actually one of the most rigorous, hardcore mathematical and astronomical geniuses in human history.
It's wild to think about.
We are talking about a polymath who mapped the solar year more accurately than the calendar you and I have hanging on our walls right now.
The disconnect between the man's actual historical life and his global pop culture legacy is just staggering. We are looking at the life of Ghiyath al-Din Abu Afat Umar ibn Ibrahim Nishapuri.
Which is quite a name.
It is, but he is much better known to the world as Omar Khayyam, and he lived from 1048 to 1131.
So, welcome to this deep dive into our sources today. Our mission is to basically figure out how a mind that spanned the golden age of Islamic science, shaped algebra, and fundamentally redefined time itself. How does a guy like that end up becoming a Victorian pop culture icon for a book of poetry that he might not have even written?
It really is one of history's greatest ironies.
I was trying to wrap my head around this during my prep, and it feels like, well, imagine if we flash forward at 900 years from now and Albert Einstein was remembered by the entire world solely for writing a best-selling book of limericks about drinking beer.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. And everyone just entirely forgot about the theory of relativity. I mean, how does a legacy get that scrambled?
Well, to understand how a preeminent mathematician gets mistaken for a bohemian poet, we first have to look at the highly volatile, politically charged world that built his mind. Khayyam was born in May 1048 in the city of Nishapur.
Okay.
And at the time, this was a major bustling metropolis in the Seljuk Empire, which is located in modern-day Iran.
And his surname, Khayyam, translates to tent maker in Arabic, right?
Exactly.
Which sort of suggests he didn't come from royalty or elite wealth. He had, working class ancestry.
That is the widely held assumption among historians, yeah. But regardless of his family's trade, Omar was an absolute prodigy. The sources tell us he memorized the Quran at a very young age. He dove deep into the religious sciences, but he didn't stop there. He transitioned into studying the works of scientific titans, like Avicenna and Ptolemy. By the time he was in his 20s, he was living in Samarkand, writing treatises on algebra that were so profound, the local Karakhanid ruler would actually seat Khayyam right beside him on his throne.
Wait, really? So you have a 20-something math prodigy basically acting as the right hand to a king?
Yeah. But he didn't stay there, because in 1074, peace was established with a rival ruler, Sultan Malik Shah I.
Right.
The Sultan's Grand Vizier, a very powerful figure named Nizam al-Mulk, invited Khayyam to court. And Malik Shah essentially gave Khayyam a blank check.
Which is the dream for any scientist.
Oh, absolutely. He commissioned him to set up a massive state-of-the-art observatory in the city of Isfahan. Khayyam was put in charge of a panel of 8 elite scholars with one massive goal.
Which was?
Completely revise the Persian calendar.
Which sounds like an incredible scientific opportunity. But I'm curious about the motivations here. Why are these rival kings throwing unlimited funds at an astronomer?
That's a great question.
Is funding science in the 11th century just a massive political flex to show off how rich your empire is?
It is absolutely a political flex, but it's also about raw control. Science and political power were deeply entangled back then. For a sultan, funding a grand observatory wasn't just about a personal curiosity for stargazing.
It's a practical.
Highly practical. Think about how an empire functions. A highly accurate calendar was crucial for standardizing the collection of taxes, for predicting agricultural cycles across vast territories.
Oh, right. You need to know exactly when to plant and harvest.
Exactly. And crucially, it was for projecting an image of absolute divine order. If your court can accurately map the heavens, it proves your empire is the center of the intellectual universe.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. It's like a medieval space race. It proves you have the mandate to rule.
Precisely. But this entanglement of science and royal politics was incredibly dangerous. When your entire career, your funding, and your physical safety are tied to a throne well, you are entirely reliant on the survival of the person sitting on it.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. But before we get to the political fallout, we need to understand what he actually achieved in Isfahan with that blank check, because that royal funding allowed Khayyam to fundamentally rewrite humanity's understanding of space and time.
He really did.
Let's start with time, because his work on the calendar is just mind-blowing.
It really is. The panel inaugurated the Jalali calendar in 1079. Now, to appreciate this, we have to understand the problem with calendars.
The messy math of the solar system.
Exactly. The Earth does not take exactly 365 days to orbit the sun. It takes roughly 365.2422 days. Because of that messy fraction, our human calendars constantly drift out of sync with the actual physical seasons.
Right, and our modern solution to that is adding a leap year every 4 years. We just tack on an extra day in February to catch up.
Exactly. But adding one day every 4 years is actually a very blunt instrument. It slightly overcompensates. Khayyam and his team realized this.
So they didn't use the 4-year rule.
No. Instead of a rigid 4-year rule, they implemented a highly sophisticated 33-year cycle. Within that 33-year period, there are exactly 8 leap years, strategically spaced out.
And because of that spacing, the calculation they arrived at for the solar year was exactly 365.214.19858,156 days. I mean, the fact that they calculated that in the 11th century without telescopes, without satellites, without computers, it is just astounding to me.
The precision is uncompromising. To put that in perspective for you, the Gregorian calendar, which is the one the West adopted in 1582, and the one synced to your smartphone right now, has an error rate of 1 day every 3,330 years.
Okay, and what was Khayyam's error rate?
The Jalali calendar has an error rate of just 1 day every 5,000 years.
Wait, really? So the calendar Khayyam devised nearly 1,000 years ago is objectively more precise than the one the modern world uses today?
Without a doubt. The foundation of his calendar is actually still in use in Iran today. But his mastery wasn't limited to charting time. He revolutionized mathematics, too. Specifically, he found a way to link algebra and geometry, which were previously thought of as totally separate disciplines.
And this is where the mechanics of his genius really shine.
Right.
Because, I mean, for anyone who remembers high school math, algebra is all abstract numbers and letters.
Right.
And geometry is all physical shapes and angles. How did he actually connect them?
He tackled something called cubic equations. Think of an equation where a variable is multiplied by itself 3 times, like x to the 3rd power.
Okay, sure.
In the 11th century, pure arithmetic couldn't solve these complex, abstract equations. Khayyam realized that if you can't solve it with numbers alone, you have to visualize it. He was the very first person to provide a general method for solving all 3rd-degree cubic equations by drawing shapes.
Drawing shapes. How does drawing a shape solve an abstract algebra problem?
He used what we call conic sections. Imagine he graphed a parabola like the arc of a thrown ball, and then he graphed a circle over it.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The exact physical point on the graph where the line of the circle intersects with the line of the parabola gives you the numerical coordinate you need to solve the algebraic equation. He wrote that algebras are geometric facts.
That is brilliant. It's like he's playing 3D chess while European mathematicians are still trying to figure out the rules of checkers. He is literally using the physical intersections of geometry to hack the abstract problems of algebra.
That is a perfect analogy. He was essentially predating the analytical geometry of René Descartes by 500 years. Khayyam even noted in his writings that the pure arithmetic solutions were out of reach for his era, famously saying that possibly someone else will come to know it after us.
And was he right?
He was. It took until the 16th century in Renaissance Italy for mathematicians to solve those equations without drawing shapes.
That's incredible. Did this visual approach push him to question the basic rules of geometry itself?
It absolutely did. Have you ever heard of Euclid's parallel postulate?
Vaguely. That's the basic geometrical rule that if you draw 2 parallel lines, they will never, ever touch. Right?
Yeah, assuming you were drawing them on a perfectly flat surface. But Khayyam deeply analyzed this postulate using a shape called the Khayyam-Sakkari quadrilateral. By questioning the fundamental rules of parallel lines, he was inadvertently testing the boundaries of flat space.
Oh.
This opened the theoretical door to non-Euclidean geometry, which is the mathematics of curved space, like drawing parallel lines on a globe where they eventually intersect at the poles. Centuries later, that is the exact type of math Albert Einstein relied on for his theory of relativity.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
He is laying the groundwork for how we understand the fabric of the universe. So, we have a man who is at the absolute peak of the scientific world. He has unlimited funding, he's charting the solar year, he's inventing new branches of math.
Yep, he was at the top.
But you mentioned earlier that his safety was entirely dependent on his royal patron. And in 1092, the bill comes due.
It all collapses in a matter of months. Sultan Malik Shah dies. And around the same time, his powerful vizier, the man who brought Khayyam to court, also dies.
Was it natural causes?
Well, the Sultan might have been, but the vizier wasn't just sick. It is widely believed he was assassinated by a famous secretive order known as the Ismailis.
Wow. So I want you to imagine your entire career, your life's work, and your physical safety just vaporizing overnight because your CEO was murdered.
That's exactly what it was like. Funding dries up immediately. That grand, state-of-the-art Isfahan observatory is simply abandoned to the elements. Khayyam is stripped of his royal protection, and suddenly he's completely exposed.
But exposed to who? Why would a mathematician be in danger?
Because he was a man of intense logic and scientific rigor in a deeply orthodox religious era. With his powerful protectors gone, hostile local clerics began turning on him.
What were they accusing him of?
They accused Khayyam of unorthodoxy, dangerous skepticism, and possibly even harboring sympathies for Zoroastrianism, the ancient pre-Islamic religion of the region. In the 11th century, these were not just academic critiques. These were accusations of heresy that could easily cost a man his life.
So what is a hyperlogical scientist supposed to do when a mob of religious clerics wants him executed?
He goes on the Hajj. He makes a highly visible public pilgrimage to Mecca. According to historians of his era, this was very likely a calculated survival tactic. It was a public demonstration of faith meant to allay suspicions, silence his critics, and essentially save his own neck.
The ultimate medieval PR stunt. The man who calculated the perfect calendar to 11 decimal places couldn't predict the political storm that would end his career.
The irony is sharp. When he eventually returned to his hometown of Nishapur, he was in declining health and lived largely as a recluse.
That's so sad.
It is, but there is actually a detail from the historical sources about his later years that is wonderfully tragic and funny. A new sultan eventually asked Khayyam to come back to court to work as an astrologer.
Oh, no.
Yeah. His job was to predict the weather based on the stars. And apparently he was terrible at it, mostly because Khayyam didn't actually believe in astrology.
That is amazing. A brilliant astronomer, the guy who mapped the solar year, reduced to being a reluctant weatherman, forced to use a pseudoscience he privately knew was total nonsense.
It's a humiliating come down.
This brings us to the central mystery of his life. We know he went on the pilgrimage to save his life. But what was his actual inner reality?
That's the big question.
Right. Was he a devout believer just keeping his head down? Or was he a secret rebel burning with resentment? Because that exact question is at the heart of the poetry that made him world famous. The Rubaiyat.
The Rubaiyat simply refers to a collection of his quatrains, which are 4-line poems. And this is where the historical Khayyam collides with the legendary Khayyam. If you read these verses literally, they project the voice of an Epicurean atheist.
For those who might not know, what exactly does Epicurean mean in this context?
An Epicurean philosophy suggests that the ultimate goal of life is to seek peace and pleasure in the present moment, in the here and now, largely because it rejects the fear of angry gods or the promise of an afterlife.
And that tone really bleeds through the poetry. The translated verses in our sources are incredibly biting. One poem flat out rejects the afterlife, saying, "Men talk of heaven, there is no heaven but here. Men talk of hell, there is no hell but here."
Yeah, that is pretty definitive.
That definitely doesn't sound like a man who went to Mecca out of pure spiritual devotion.
It doesn't, and many later thinkers took this literally. The prominent Iranian novelist Sadegh Hedayat argued passionately that Khayyam was a pure materialist.
What did he mean by that?
Hedayat stated that Khayyam didn't believe in a separate eternal soul. He believed our bodies are just matter, and when we die, we simply decompose into clay that might eventually be dug up and molded into a jug of wine. It's a philosophy of absolute agnostic skepticism facing the brutal reality of death.
But there is a counter-argument to this, isn't there? I know some scholars claim he wasn't an atheist at all, but actually a Sufi mystic.
Yes, there is a whole school of thought that argues Khayyam's poetry is deeply esoteric. They argue that in the tradition of Sufi poetry, physical things like wine and intoxication are just classic metaphors for divine enlightenment and spiritual rapture.
So the wine isn't literal.
Exactly. Under this interpretation, he isn't drinking actual wine, he is intoxicated by the love of God.
Okay, but I remember reading one of the translated verses in my prep for this deep dive, and he literally calls the religious establishment a maggot-minded fanatic crew. I just don't see how anyone can spin maggots and fanatics into a beautiful metaphor about spiritual devotion.
It's a tough sell.
It sounds like a hyper-rational scientist who is just incredibly fed up with hypocrites dictating his life.
You're not alone in that assessment. And historically, the strict Sufi mystics of Khayyam's own era completely rejected him. A celebrated mystic named Attar wrote that Khayyam was a free-thinking scientist who was awaiting punishment in the hereafter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, another Sufi writer described him explicitly as an unhappy philosopher, atheist, and materialist.
So if the mystics of his own day didn't think he was a mystic, why did that theory even start?
That brings us to the biggest mystery of all the authorship myth. There is a very real possibility that Omar Khayyam didn't even write the Rubaiyat.
Wait, really? The guy famous worldwide for these poems might not have written them. How does that happen?
The earliest historical texts written during his lifetime praise him endlessly as a towering scientist and philosopher. They barely mention poetry. In fact, only 5 of these quatrains were found in texts circulating within 30 years of his death.
Only 5?
Yes. But over the next few centuries, hundreds and hundreds of poems were suddenly attributed to him.
Oh, I see what's happening. If you are a frustrated intellectual in a strict religious society and you want to write a cynical, rebellious poem about the afterlife, you don't put your own name on it because you'll be executed.
Right.
You just slap the name Omar Khayyam on it because he's already dead and famous for being a little unorthodox. He became a safe pseudonym.
Exactly. It became a literary tradition to attribute skeptical thoughts to him. Some modern scholars, like Hans Heinrich Schaeder in the 1930s, argued that the name of Omar Khayyam should be struck entirely from the history of Persian literature because there's so little solid proof he wrote them.
And what do other scholars think?
Others take a middle road. They suggest that Khayyam did write a few poems, but merely as a private hobby, something he shared anonymously with a close inner circle of disciples to blow off steam, never intending them for publication.
Well, whether he wrote every single word or none of them at all, those rebellious verses took on a life of their own 700 years later.
Yeah.
And this completely hijacked his legacy in the West. Which brings us to the pop culture explosion.
This is where a 19th century British writer named Edward FitzGerald enters the story. In 1859, FitzGerald published a very loose, highly interpretive English translation of the Rubaiyat.
How interpretive are we talking?
Very. FitzGerald explicitly leaned into the religious skepticism. He stated in his preface that the wine in the poems was the veritable juice of the grape and absolutely not some divine Sufi allegory.
And this translation didn't exactly fly off the shelves at first, did it?
Not at all. It bombed. It sat forgotten in the remainder bin of a bookshop for a penny. But then it was discovered by artists in the pre-Raphaelite movement. This was the late 19th century, a period known as the fin de siècle.
Which means end of the century,
Right.
right? It was that era when strict, stuffy Victorian morals were starting to crumble, and people were looking for art that was a bit more rebellious, romantic, and cynical.
Precisely. The English-speaking world was hungry for exactly what FitzGerald was selling. The book triggered a massive cult phenomenon. Suddenly, Omar Khayyam clubs were springing up across Britain and America.
And that explosion of Victorian obsession is exactly how we get the famous moving finger quatrain embedded into global culture. That is the only reason Agatha Christie uses it for a novel title, why Martin Luther King Jr. quotes it to protest the Vietnam War, and why Bill Clinton uses it to apologize on national television.
It's all connected.
It is entirely because of this 19th century British literary craze. Khayyam even has a lunar crater and an asteroid named after him now. So how do we synthesize this bizarre double life? FitzGerald essentially invented the Omar the tent maker brand for the West. Are we celebrating an 11th century Persian scientific genius or a 19th century British literary invention?
I think we're celebrating a human bridge between two profound extremes. Think about his life. On one hand, Khayyam dedicated himself to rigid mathematical truth. He sought to control the universe through the exact, predictable movements of the stars, creating a calendar of flawless precision.
And the other.
On the other hand, the persona of Khayyam in the Rubaiyat grapples with the exact opposite, the chaotic, unknowable, and terminal nature of human existence. The science tries to command the universe. The poetry surrenders to it.
That's a beautiful way to frame it. He represents the human desire to understand everything and the human tragedy of knowing we eventually just turn to dust anyway.
There is a remarkably touching story from one of his disciples, a man named Nizami Aruzi, that captures this duality perfectly. Sometime around the year 1112, Khayyam was in the city of Balkh, and he casually made a prophecy to his friends.
What did you say?
He said, "My tomb shall be in a spot where the north wind may scatter roses over it."
Which is a very poetic thing for a hardcore mathematician to say.
Indeed. Well, years after Khayyam died in 1131, Aruzi traveled to Nishapur to visit his master's grave. He found the tomb situated at the foot of a garden wall.
Did it have roses?
Even better. Just as Khayyam had predicted, pear and apricot trees had thrust their branches over the wall, dropping their flowers so perfectly that his tombstone was completely hidden beneath a blanket of falling blossoms.
Wow. It's almost as if he mathematically calculated exactly where the wind would blow the petals. We have journeyed from an 11th century royal observatory mapping the stars all the way to 19th century British drawing rooms obsessing over verses about wine and dust.
It is a legacy that is just as complex and just as deeply layered as the geometric equations he used to solve algebra.
It really is. And it leaves me with one final thought to mull over. If Omar Khayyam was right that time is just a strict physical mathematical formula, an exact predictable 33-year cycle, with an error of just one day in 5,000 years, how is it that his own human legacy was so wildly unpredictable?
It's the ultimate paradox.
Here is a brilliant mathematician whose life's work was rewritten centuries later by a British poet, and who is now quoted by American presidents making political apologies. It just shows that while you can measure the solar year down to the decimal, you absolutely cannot measure the chaotic whims of history. Which leaves you wondering, 900 years from now, what entirely unrelated, unexpected thing will you be remembered for?